Welcome to today's episode of Ancient Survival Chronicles. Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of the Arabian Peninsula 120,000 years ago. Behind you lies Africa, the cradle of your species. Ahead stretches what should be an impassable barrier, hundreds of thousands of square miles of what will one day become some of Earth's harshest deserts. The sun beats down mercilessly, the horizon shimmers with heat, and every survival instinct screams at you to turn back. Yet you don't. You can't, because something extraordinary is happening. The desert is transforming before your eyes. Where sand dunes should dominate, grasslands stretch toward distant horizons. Ancient lake beds that have lain dry for millennia now shimmer with fresh water. Rivers flow where none have existed for tens of thousands of years. This is Green Arabia, a climatic window so brief in geological terms that missing it could mean the difference between humanity's global expansion and extinction in a single continent. How did our ancestors recognize these fleeting opportunities? How did they navigate across landscapes that could shift from paradise to death trap within a single generation? What drove them to risk everything crossing wastelands that would later become synonymous with desolation? The answers lie buried beneath sand dunes in Saudi Arabia, preserved in ancient lake sediments, frozen in fossilized footprints, and encoded in the stone tools our ancestors left behind as breadcrumbs across 400,000 years of human history. This isn't a story of reckless wandering or blind luck. It's a tale of sophisticated environmental reading, strategic timing, and the kind of desperate courage that defines our species. Today, we uncover how early humans crossed the desert wastelands, not despite the odds, but by understanding them better than anyone thought possible. Chapter 1. The Green Windows. When deserts became highways, the Nafa Desert of northern Saudi Arabia is unforgiving. Temperatures soar past 50 degrees Celsius in summer. Annual rainfall measures in mere millimeters. Vast sand dunes, some reaching heights of 100 meters, create an ocean of shifting earth that swallows landmarks and obscures paths. Modern vehicles with GPS, air conditioning, and emergency supplies cross this wasteland with caution. The idea that prehistoric humans walked across this landscape seems impossible. Yet they did, repeatedly, over hundreds of thousands of years. The secret lies in understanding that deserts aren't permanent. Climate operates on cycles, some spanning decades, others millennia. Earth's orbital variations, changes in the tilt of its axis, and wobbles in its rotation create predictable patterns in solar radiation reaching different parts of the planet. These Milankovitch cycles, as scientists call them, drive ice ages and interglacial periods. But they do more than freeze or melt polar caps. They redirect monsoons, shift rainfall patterns, and transform entire continents. For the Arabian Peninsula, these cycles created what researchers now call Green Arabia events. Analysis of ancient lake sediments, paleoclimate records from cave formations, and sophisticated climate modeling reveal at least 5 major greening periods over the past 400,000 years. These windows occurred approximately 400,000, 300,000, 200, 0, 130,000 to 75,000 and 55,000 years ago. Each lasted thousands of years long, enough for multiple human generations to live and die in landscapes unrecognizable to modern eyes. During these green periods, something remarkable happened. The intertropical convergence zone, a belt of low pressure near the equator where northeast and southeast trade winds meet, shifted northward. This movement brought moisture-laden monsoon winds deep into the Arabian interior, regions that today see virtually no rainfall. Climate models suggest annual precipitation increased from less than 100 millimeters to over 300 millimeters. That doesn't sound dramatic, but it represented the difference between barren wasteland and viable grassland ecosystem. Archaeological excavations at a site called Kalamash in 4 Cam-4, and in the Fud Desert, provide extraordinary evidence of this transformation. Researchers found 5 distinct Paleolake deposits stacked one atop another, each representing a different Green Arabia event. These weren't small puddles, they were substantial bodies of fresh water spanning kilometers, deep enough to support diverse ecosystems for thousands of years before the climate shifted again. The hollows between massive sand dunes acted as natural catch basins during wet periods. Rainfall and runoff from surrounding highlands collected in these depressions, creating lakes that persisted even during dry seasons. Sediment cores from these ancient lake beds revealed distinctive layers. Gray-green sediments rich in organic matter indicate periods of active lake formation with abundant plant and animal life. Above and below these layers sit reddish-brown desert sediments marking the return of arid conditions. Dating these sediments using luminescence techniques, which measure when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight before burial, provides precise chronology. The results are stunning. Every single Green Arabia event over the past 400,000 years left its signature in the KAM4 sequence. More importantly, every single one of these wet periods shows evidence of human presence. The environmental transformation wasn't subtle. During Green Arabia peaks, the peninsula supported ecosystems similar to modern East African savanna. Grasslands dominated where today only sparse, drought-resistant shrubs survive. Acacia trees dotted the landscape. Rivers flowed year-round, fed by reliable rainfall. The fossil record from these periods includes species that tell the story vividly: hippos wallowing in freshwater lakes, elephants browsing on savanna vegetation, horses grazing open plains. For early humans emerging from Africa, these green periods created corridors of opportunity. The Arabian Peninsula served as the only land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. During arid phases, it formed an impassable barrier. Even modern nomadic peoples with thousands of years of desert survival knowledge avoid the deep interior during drought years. But when the rains came, when grassland spread and water flowed, the peninsula transformed from barrier into highway. The timing of these green windows aligned remarkably with other evidence of human migration. The oldest stone tools found in Arabia, hand axes dated to 400,000 years ago, appear in sediments from the first Green Arabia event. Tools from subsequent wet periods showed different manufacturing techniques, suggesting multiple waves of migration from different source populations. The most recent wet period, around 55,000 years ago, corresponds with genetic evidence for the successful modern human expansion that ultimately populated the entire globe. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Humans didn't stumble into Arabia by accident during wet periods. They recognized these windows of opportunity and exploited them deliberately. The archaeological record shows repeated occupations during every single wet phase, suggesting that populations maintained knowledge about the peninsula across tens of thousands of years. When conditions improved, they returned. When drought returned, they retreated or died, but their descendants tried again when the climate shifted. This pattern of opportunistic expansion reveals sophisticated environmental awareness. Early humans understood that landscapes change, that today's wasteland might be tomorrow's paradise. They recognized indicators of climate shifts, perhaps changes in vegetation in bordering regions, animal migrations, or atmospheric patterns. They timed their movements to coincide with favorable conditions, demonstrating planning horizons that extended beyond individual lifetimes. Modern satellite imagery combined with archaeological surveys has identified over 10,000 Paleolake sites across Arabia. Each represents a potential way station in ancient human journeys. The sheer number suggests an extensive network of water sources during wet periods, making long-distance travel feasible. Humans could move across the peninsula in stages, never more than a day or two from reliable water. The Green Arabia events weren't unique to recent human history. Cave deposits show similar cyclical patterns extending back 8 million years. During those ancient wet periods, mammals freely exchanged between Africa and Eurasia, using Arabia as a natural land bridge. When our hominin ancestors began expanding from Africa, they were following paths worn by millions of years of animal migration. The roots were ancient. Humans simply learned to read the signs and time their movements accordingly. Understanding these green windows fundamentally changes how we view early human migration. It wasn't a desperate, random wandering into hostile territory. It was strategic exploitation of predictable environmental changes. Our ancestors crossed the desert wastelands not by conquering them, but by recognizing brief periods when wastelands became anything but. They survived by being at the right place at the right time, and that timing wasn't luck. It was knowledge, observation, and intergenerational transmission of environmental wisdom that spelled the difference between expansion and extinction. Chapter 2. Reading the Wasteland. How early humans predicted viable routes. Stand at the edge of the African continent 400,000 years ago and ask yourself, how do you know it's safe to venture into the unknown? You can see deserts stretching ahead, but you can't see 500 kilometers into the Arabian interior where lakes might or might not exist. You have no maps, no satellite imagery, no weather forecasts. Making the wrong decision means death for your entire group. Yet humans made this journey successfully, repeatedly. They must have had ways of reading the environment that we're only beginning to understand. The first and most obvious indicator would have been vegetation changes in bordering regions. Deserts don't green instantly. The transformation takes years or decades as moisture patterns shift. Humans living in the Levant or along the Red Sea coast would have noticed changes in their local environments that signaled broader climate shifts. Drought-resistant plants giving way to moisture-loving species. Seasonal streams flowing longer into dry seasons. Lakes that have been dry for generations suddenly holding water year-round. Animal behavior provided another crucial signal. Large herbivores are highly sensitive to forage availability and water sources. During the early stages of Green Arabia events, animals from Africa and the Levant would have begun exploring the peninsula's margins, following improved conditions inland. Humans who paid attention to these migrations gained valuable intelligence about conditions ahead. If elephants and hippos were moving north into Arabia, water and vegetation must be adequate to support them. Modern hunter-gatherer societies demonstrate sophisticated environmental knowledge that almost certainly has deep prehistoric roots. Australian Aboriginal peoples, for instance, maintain detailed mental maps covering thousands of square kilometers, updated through observation, story, and intergroup communication. They recognize hundreds of plant species and understand their seasonal cycles, water requirements, and usefulness as indicators of underground water sources. Sand peoples of southern Africa can read landscape features invisible to untrained eyes, identifying ancient watercourses and predicting where digging will find moisture, even in severe drought. Our ancestors crossing into Arabia probably possessed similar capabilities. They understood that certain plant species only grow where water tables remain relatively high. They recognized geological features, specific rock formations, soil colors, topographic depressions that indicated good prospects for water. They read animal tracks and droppings to determine what species were present, their numbers, and how recently they had passed through an area. The concept of landscape memory becomes crucial here. Humans don't just observe their immediate surroundings. They maintain mental models of landscapes extending far beyond personal experience. These models incorporate information from parents, elders, and visitors from other groups. They include locations of water sources, seasonal patterns of resource availability, dangerous terrain, and routes connecting key locations. When early humans ventured into Arabia, they weren't stepping blind into unknown territory. They were following information networks, building on knowledge accumulated and shared across populations. Evidence suggests that during Green Arabia events, populations maintained contact across the expanding habitable zone. Stone tools from different Arabian sites show both local characteristics and similarities, suggesting cultural exchange. Raw materials were transported considerable distances. High-quality flint moved 50 to 100 kilometers from source areas to manufacturing sites. This movement wasn't random. It indicates deliberate planning and knowledge of where good stone could be found across extensive territories. The routes themselves would have been carefully chosen. Not all parts of Arabia greened equally during wet periods. Highland areas received more rainfall than lowland basins. River valleys maintained flowing water, even when surrounding plains dried seasonally. Successful crossings required identifying these more reliable zones and planning routes that connected them. Archaeological evidence shows that human sites cluster along ancient watercourses and at major lake basins, suggesting humans understood topography and hydrology well enough to predict where resources would be most reliable. Timing was as important as route selection. Even during Green Arabia events, climate varied seasonally. Monsoon rains came at specific times of year, and streams might flow for only months before drying. Plant resources peaked at particular seasons. Animal migrations followed predictable patterns. Successfully crossing Arabia required coordinating movement with these cycles. Starting a journey just as the dry season began could be fatal. Starting as rains arrived improved odds dramatically. How did prehistoric humans track seasons without calendars or written records? The same way traditional peoples do today through careful observation of astronomical patterns, plant phenology, and animal behavior. The position of stars, the length of days, the timing of flowering and fruiting of key plant species all provided calendrical information accurate enough for planning major movements. Combined with knowledge passed from elders who remembered previous year's patterns, groups could time migrations with reasonable precision. Risk assessment was another critical skill. Not every group needed to venture into unknown territory. Some could remain in familiar areas while others explored. If exploring groups found good conditions, they could send information back either through return visits or through trade and social networks connecting groups. If exploring groups disappeared, that conveyed information too, albeit at terrible cost. This distribution of risk meant that populations as a whole could explore new territory while maintaining core populations in known refuges. The cognitive demands of this environmental reading were substantial. It required memory of conditions across multiple years, integration of information from numerous sources, prediction of future conditions based on current observations, and communication of complex spatial and temporal information. These aren't simple stimulus-response behaviors. They demand the kind of abstract thinking, planning, and social learning that characterize modern human cognition. Neurological evidence supports the idea that these cognitive capabilities were present in the populations crossing Arabia. Brain sizes had already reached modern ranges, and the complexity of stone tool manufacture found in Arabia requires sophisticated motor control, spatial reasoning, and social learning. If these populations could master live alwash stone technology, a highly complex reduction sequence requiring extensive planning and skill, they certainly had cognitive capacity for sophisticated environmental prediction. Language played a crucial role in transmitting and maintaining this environmental knowledge. You can't pass on complex information about distant landscapes, seasonal patterns, or predictive indicators without sophisticated communication. The very fact that humans successfully exploited brief, Green Arabia windows across 400,000 years suggests that information about the peninsula and strategies for crossing it persisted in cultural knowledge even during the long arid periods when the route was impassable. Modern experiments with hunter-gatherer populations show that environmental knowledge is actively taught, not just passively absorbed. Adults deliberately instruct children and adolescents in resource identification, landscape reading, and prediction. They take them to important locations and explain significance. They tell stories encoding crucial information about past events, resource distributions, and survival strategies. These teaching traditions almost certainly have deep prehistoric roots, developed precisely because such knowledge was life or death important. The archaeological signature of this environmental wisdom appears in the strategic placement of sites. Humans didn't occupy Arabia randomly during wet periods. They concentrated in areas with the most reliable water, the best access to multiple resource zones, and the easiest movement routes. At Cam-4, the positioning near the junction of ancient rivers and at a major lake basin wasn't coincidental. It was strategic site selection by people who understood landscape properties and resource distributions. Weather prediction, while less precise than modern meteorology, was probably more sophisticated than we might assume. Many traditional peoples can predict rainfall from cloud patterns, wind directions, atmospheric pressure changes sensed as physical sensations, and animal behavior. While they can't forecast weeks ahead, they can anticipate immediate weather changes accurately enough to plan daily activities, seek shelter before storms, or time hunting efforts to take advantage of game movement before weather shifts. Perhaps most impressive was the meta-knowledge that landscapes change over timescales beyond individual lifespans. Recognizing that a current wasteland might have been habitable in the past and could become habitable again requires thinking beyond personal experience. It demands integration of evidence from geological features, fossil remains, and cultural memory preserved in stories. It requires abstract reasoning about time, change, and cyclical patterns. Yet this understanding was essential for the repeated reoccupation of Arabia during successive green periods. The reading of desert wastelands, then, was far more sophisticated than simple observation. It was a complex integration of botanical knowledge, geological understanding, animal behavior interpretation, astronomical observation, social information sharing, and cognitive modeling of landscapes and time. Our ancestors weren't stumbling blindly into deadly territory. They were making calculated decisions based on the best environmental intelligence available to them. That they succeeded so many times, across so many generations, testifies to the sophistication of their environmental literacy. Chapter 3. Following the Ancient Lakes. Water as the ultimate guide. Water is life. This truism becomes starkly literal in desert environments where humans can survive perhaps 3 days without hydration. Every decision early humans made about crossing Arabia ultimately traced back to water, where to find it, how to recognize reliable sources, and how to plan routes that never strayed too far from the next drink. The ancient lakes of Green Arabia were more than just water sources. They were oases, navigation markers, and the very foundation of survival strategy. Archaeological surveys using satellite imagery have revolutionized understanding of Arabia's ancient hydrology. Remote sensing can detect slight variations in soil composition, vegetation patterns, and surface topography that reveal ancient water features invisible to ground-level observation. Across the Arabian Peninsula, researchers have identified more than 10,000 Paleolake sites, former lake basins that held water during wet periods. These weren't puddles. Analysis of sediment depths and basin morphology indicates many ancient lakes were substantial bodies of water, some covering tens of square kilometers and reaching depths of several meters. The largest Paleolake basins in the Nifa Desert would have rivaled modern lakes like Utah as Great Salt Lake in area during peak Green Arabia periods. Interconnected by rivers and streams during the wettest phases, they created corridors of habitability stretching across the peninsula. The distribution of these ancient lakes wasn't random, but followed topographic patterns that determined water accumulation. The massive sand dunes that dominate Arabia today existed during wet periods too, but between them lay inner dune depressions, low areas where water naturally collected. Some depressions had impermeable clay layers that prevented rapid drainage, allowing lakes to persist through dry seasons and even modest drought years. These would have been the most valuable water sources, reliable even when seasonal streams dried. Ground surveys of Paleolake sites revealed their importance to ancient humans. At virtually every major lake basin where researchers have excavated, they find stone tools, animal bones, and other evidence of human presence. The correlation is striking. Where water existed, humans occupied. This pattern repeats across different time periods and different regions of Arabia, demonstrating that water sources were absolutely fundamental to human movements and settlement patterns. The Juba Oasis, northwest of the KAM4 site, provides exceptional evidence of this water-centered survival strategy. Here, a massive paleolake persisted through multiple Green Arabia events. The surrounding landscape is covered with rock art petroglyphs depicting the animals that lived near the lake. Images of cattle, ibex, and even hippos demonstrate the diversity of fauna supported by this water source. Hundreds of archaeological sites cluster around this single lake basin, spanning hundreds of thousands of years of intermittent occupation. The types of stone tools found at lake sites reveal the activities early humans conducted there. Butchery tools suggest they processed game animals and lake shores. Scrapers indicate hide preparation. The presence of multiple tool types from different stages of manufacture suggests these weren't just brief stops but places where people spent extended periods, perhaps weeks or months. Some larger sites show evidence of repeated occupation, with layers of artifacts indicating returns over thousands of years. Animal bones preserved in lake sediments provide direct evidence of what humans hunted and scavenged. Hippo bones are particularly common at some sites, indicating these water-loving megafauna were present and targeted by hunters. The recovery of hippo remains might seem surprising in what is now harsh desert, but these animals require permanent water and only live where substantial freshwater bodies exist. Their presence is unambiguous evidence that ancient lakes were not ephemeral puddles, but long-lasting aquatic habitats. The chemical composition of ancient lake sediments reveals much about water sources and lake permanence. Freshwater lakes dominated. These were precipitation-fed systems, not saline playas like many modern desert basins. Isotopic analysis of minerals precipitated from lake water indicates that during wet periods, groundwater tables were high, and springs likely fed many lakes in addition to direct rainfall. This groundwater input would have stabilized lake levels and prevented complete drying during drought years. For early humans planning routes across Arabia, this network of lakes functioned like waypoints on a map. Moving from one lake basin to the next, groups could traverse hundreds of kilometers without facing extended waterless travel. During peak Green Arabia conditions, no point in the northern peninsula would have been more than 30 to 40 kilometers from a reliable water source, a distance a human can comfortably walk in a day. This density of water sources make cross-peninsula travel feasible even for groups including children and elderly members. Navigation between lakes would have relied on landscape knowledge and observation. Some Paleolake basins sit in distinctive topographic settings that would have been recognizable from considerable distances. Highlands rising above surrounding plains, unusual rock formations, or vegetation patterns visible from afar could all serve as landmarks guiding travelers toward known water sources. The clustering of major archaeological sites and a few especially large lake basins suggest these served as hub locations from which people explored surrounding areas, returning to major water sources as bases. The seasonal nature of some water sources required careful planning. Even during Green Arabia events, not all lakes held water year-round. Some were seasonal playas that filled during rainy periods but dried during the hot, dry season. Others were ephemeral, existing for only years or decades before the climate shifted and they disappeared. Humans had to distinguish between reliable perennial water sources and less dependable seasonal ones. Making this distinction wrong could be fatal. Evidence suggests early humans developed strategies for locating water even when direct observation wasn't possible. Modern desert-adapted peoples use multiple techniques for finding water, following animal tracks to waterholes, watching bird flight patterns at dusk when many species fly to water, reading vegetation indicators that suggest subsurface moisture, and excavating in dry stream beds where water often flows underground even when surface flow has ceased. These techniques don't require modern technology, just knowledge and observation skills, both of which our ancestors clearly possessed. The question arises, how did humans find the first water sources when initially entering a region? One answer is that animals led the way. Large herbivores must find water regularly and are excellent at locating sources. By following elephants, hippos, or other water-dependent species, humans could piggyback on animal knowledge of water locations. The strong correlation between animal fossils and human artifacts at Arabian lake sites suggests humans and animals shared these water sources, probably with humans actively tracking animals to find water. Lake edges provided more than just water. They were ecologically rich zones offering concentrated resources. Aquatic plants growing in shallow water were edible and provided food in seasons when terrestrial vegetation was less productive. Birds congregated at lakes, both resident waterfowl and migratory species, offering hunting opportunities. Fish may have populated some larger, more permanent lakes, though evidence is scarce due to poor preservation of fish bones. Even in the absence of fish, aquatic invertebrates, amphibians, and reptiles associated with water bodies provided food. The shoreline ecotone, the transition zone between aquatic and terrestrial habitats, is one of the most productive environments in terms of biodiversity and resource density. Early humans understood this and concentrated their activities in these zones. Excavations show that occupation sites cluster within 100 to 200 meters of ancient shorelines, close enough for easy water access, but far enough from flood-prone areas to avoid inundation during lake high stands. Technological developments were tied to water-based lifestyles. The creation of water containers, whether vessels made from ostrich eggshells, animal bladders, or other materials, allowed humans to carry water between sources, extending the safe distance between watering stops. While organic containers rarely preserve archaeologically, the strategic distribution of sites suggests humans had ways of transporting water. Without this capability, the distances between some occupied sites and the nearest water would have been dangerously large. The hydrology of Green Arabia also influenced human social organization. Large, reliable water sources likely served as aggregation points where multiple groups converged, enabling social interactions, made exchanges, and information sharing. During seasons when water was most scarce, populations probably concentrated near the most reliable sources. During wetter seasons, groups could disperse more widely, exploiting resources across broader territories. This pattern of seasonal aggregation and dispersal is characteristic of many desert-adapted peoples and likely has deep prehistoric roots. Lake-centered survival strategies also created vulnerability. Humans became dependent on aquatic resources to the extent that when lakes dried, as they inevitably did when Green Arabia events ended, populations faced crisis. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this. Sites occupied during wet periods were abandoned when climate shifted back to arid conditions. Whether populations died out, migrated to remaining water sources, or retreated to Africa and the Levant varies by time and location. But the dependence on lakes meant that when water disappeared, human presence disappeared too. The story of Arabia's ancient lakes is ultimately a story of adaptation and vulnerability intertwined. Water enabled the crossing of wastelands, supported populations for thousands of years, and created migration corridors that changed human history. But that same dependence on water made these populations hostage to climate forces beyond their control. Understanding this dynamic helps us appreciate both the capabilities and limitations of early human populations, and the precarious balance between environmental opportunity and environmental constraint that define their existence. Chapter 4. The Hippo Hunters. Tracking megafauna across grasslands. Few animals symbolize the transformation of Arabia during green periods more dramatically than hippos. These massive semi-aquatic mammals require permanent freshwater and substantial grazing areas. Finding hippo fossils in the heart of what is now the world's most arid desert is like discovering penguin remains in the Sahara. It fundamentally challenges assumptions about the landscape. Yet hippo bones appear repeatedly in Arabian Paleolithic deposits, and with them comes evidence that early humans hunted these formidable animals. The presence of hippos in ancient Arabia tells us several things immediately. First, water was not just present but abundant. A single hippo needs 150 to 200 liters of water daily, and herds require permanent water deep enough for full submersion. Second, vegetation with substantial hippos or grazing herbivores consuming 40 to 50 kilograms of plant material per night. Third, the climate must have been mild enough that lakes didn't freeze, not a major concern in Arabia even during ice ages, but indicative of generally moderate conditions. Fourth, the ecosystem was African in character. Hippos never evolved in Eurasia, but dispersed from Africa when corridor habitats opened. For early humans entering Arabia from Africa, encountering familiar megafauna would have been both reassuring and economically crucial. These were un-alien species requiring new hunting strategies. They were the same or closely related animals humans had hunted in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Seeing hippos, elephants, and familiar herbivores meant humans could apply existing ecological knowledge and hunting techniques in new terrain. The megafauna were living proof that, if these animals can survive here, so can we. Archaeological evidence shows humans indeed hunted these large animals. At several Arabian sites, hippo bones bear cut marks from stone tools, indicating butchery. The marks appear in locations consistent with the fleshing and dismembering carcasses across major joints, along long bones and on skulls where tongue and brain would have been accessed. The pattern matches butchery evidence from African sites where hippo hunting is well documented. Hunting hippos is dangerous. Despite their docile appearance, hippos are aggressive, powerful animals responsible for more human deaths in Africa than any other large animal. A full-grown male weighs up to 1,800 kilograms and can run surprisingly fast on land. Their massive jaws can bite a human in half, and they defend territories aggressively. How did early humans, without firearms or even bows and arrows, successfully hunt these beasts? The answer lies in cooperation, strategy, and environmental knowledge. Modern hunter-gatherers who take hippos use techniques likely similar to those of our ancestors. They typically target animals on land at night when hippos leave water to graze. Using multiple hunters with spears and working as coordinated teams, they can drive hippos toward water where wounded animals flee instinctively. Following wounded animals into water is dangerous. The blood loss eventually weakens hippos, allowing hunters to finish them from shore. Alternatively, hunters sometimes ambush hippos at water entry and exit points where the animals follow established trails and move predictably. The payoff for successful hippo hunts was enormous. A single adult provided hundreds of kilograms of meat, enough to feed a group of 3040 people for weeks if the meat was preserved through drying or smoking. The fat was particularly valuable in an environment where most game would have been relatively lean. Hides could be used for clothing, shelter, or containers. Bones provided material for tools. Nothing was wasted. because the effort and risk of the hunt made every part of the animal precious. But hippos weren't the only megafauna humans pursued in Arabia. Elephant fossils appear at some sites, and while direct evidence of human predation is limited, the association suggests interaction. Elephants provided even more meat than hippos if full-grown. African elephant might weigh 5,000 kilograms, but were correspondingly more dangerous to hunt. Humans probably scavenged elephant carcasses more often than they actively hunted them, though coordinated groups with spears could potentially have driven elephants into situations where they could be killed with minimal risk to hunters. Horses were abundant in Green Arabia, as evidenced by numerous fossil finds and rock art depictions. These ancestors of modern horses were smaller than domestic breeds, but still substantial animals providing significant meat yields. Unlike hippos and elephants, horses were plains-dwelling grazers that could be hunted using techniques similar to those for other ungulates driving herds toward natural barriers, using spear throwers to deliver projectiles at distance or ambushing at water sources where animals came to drink. The diversity of megafauna in Arabia during wet periods created what ecologists call a hunting mosaic, a landscape with multiple prey species requiring different hunting strategies and providing different benefits. This diversity reduced risk. If one prey species was scarce, others could be targeted. Seasonal variations in animal behavior and distribution meant different species were optimally available at different times. Humans who understood this diversity and could exploit multiple species had advantages over those specialized on single prey types. Tracking was fundamental to hunting megafauna. Large animals leave obvious signs: footprints, dung, feeding damage to vegetation, trails through grasslands. Modern hunter-gatherers demonstrate incredibly sophisticated tracking abilities, able to determine from footprints not just what species passed by, but individual identity, sex, size, health status, behavior, and how long ago the animal passed. These skills were certainly present in prehistoric hunters, who depended on them for survival. The rock art of Arabia provides vivid evidence of human megafauna interactions. At Juba and other sites, petroglyphs depict hippos, elephants, lions, and various herbivores alongside human figures. Some images appear to show hunting scenes, humans with raised arms, possibly holding weapons, positioned near animals. While interpretation of rock art is always somewhat speculative, these images suggest that interactions with megafauna were culturally important enough to memorialize in art. Social organization around big game hunting likely reinforced cooperative behaviors and group cohesion. Unlike plant gathering, which individuals could often do alone, successfully hunting megafauna required coordination. Multiple hunters had to work together, communicating plans, executing coordinated maneuvers, and sharing risk. The meat from successful hunts was likely shared extensively, reinforcing social bonds and obligations. Those who participated in dangerous hunts gained prestige, and successful hunters would have been valued community members. Gender roles in hunting are often assumed, but actually complex and variable across cultures. While men typically dominated large game hunting in most societies, women and adolescents often participated in drives, surrounded game, and were crucial in processing kills. The entire community often benefited from successful hunts through meat-sharing networks. It's probably more accurate to think of megafauna hunting as community activity rather than purely male domain, though specific roles certainly varied. The tools used for hunting evolved in response to prey characteristics. The live-o-woos technique that appears in Arabian stone tool assemblages produced sharp, thin flakes ideal for spear points. These would penetrate hide more effectively than earlier, cruder tools. The standardization of tool forms suggests craft specialization. Some individuals became particularly skilled at producing hunting weapons, their products recognized and valued by others in the community. This specialization represents another step in the evolution of complex human societies. Hunting pressure likely influenced megafauna populations and distributions. Areas of intensive human occupation showed different animal assemblages than areas humans visited less frequently. While evidence is limited, it's possible that human hunting contributed to local extinctions or population declines in some regions. The overkill hypothesis, the idea that human hunting drove Pleistocene megafauna extinctions, globally remains controversial. But there's no doubt humans were capable of significantly impacting prey populations, especially on islands or in isolated regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, extending beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. Large animals served as landscape engineers, their feeding and movements creating and maintaining habitats that benefited humans. Elephants and hippos opening vegetation and creating trails made travel easier. Their dung fertilized soils and dispersed seeds, influencing plant communities. Their carcasses, whether from natural death or human kills, supported scavenger communities that humans could exploit. In ecological terms, humans and megafauna were embedded in the same food webs, influencing each other in multiple ways. When Green Arabia events ended and climate returned to arid conditions, megafauna disappeared, either dying out locally or migrating to remaining suitable habitat in Africa or wetter regions of Asia. This loss devastated human populations dependent on large game. Without megafauna to hunt, protein and fat sources became scarce. Groups either had to adapt to different subsistence strategies, focusing on smaller game and plant foods, or they had to follow the megafauna out of increasingly inhospitable desert terrain. The megafauna of Green Arabia were more than just food sources. They were indicators, guides, and fundamental components of the ecosystems that made human presence possible. Following hippos to water, tracking elephants across grasslands, hunting horses on open plains, these activities weren't just subsistence strategies but fundamental aspects of how humans understood, navigated, and survived in the desert wastelands that periodically bloomed into life. Chapter 5. Stone tools tell stories. Different cultures, same deadly path. Pick up a 400,000-year-old stone hand axe from the Calamachian. Foresight, and you're holding more than a tool. You're holding a story frozen in rock. The shape of this bifacial implement, the flaking pattern across its surface, the choice of raw material, even the way the maker held the stone while striking it, all these details encode information about the person who made it, the culture they came from, and the technological traditions they learned and perpetuated. What makes Arabia's stone tool record extraordinary is its diversity. At the KM4 site alone, researchers have identified 5 distinct stone tool assemblages corresponding to the 5 Green Arabia events. Each assemblage is different. Each tells of a different population entering Arabia, bringing different manufacturing traditions, perhaps representing different hominin species. These tools document not a single migration, but multiple waves of expansion across 400,000 years, each taking advantage of brief climatic windows when desert became traversable. The oldest tools, dated to 400,000 years ago, belong to what archaeologists call the Lower Paleolithic Acheulean industry. These are the classic teardrop-shaped hand axes that define this period. Large bifacial tools, manufactured by removing flakes from both sides of a stone core to create sharp edges around the perimeter. The KM4 hand axes show characteristics similar to those found in East Africa during the same period, suggesting the makers came from African populations, probably Homo heidelbergensis or late Homo erectus. Creating an Acheulean hand axe isn't simple. It requires selecting appropriate raw material, typically fine-grained stone like flint or chert that fractures predictably. The maker must envision the final form while looking at an unmodified stone, then execute a precise sequence of strikes removing flakes in the base, right locations and right order to achieve the desired shape. Mistakes early in the sequence can't be corrected later. This demands sophisticated cognitive abilities, mental template maintenance, sequential planning, motor control, and understanding of fracture mechanics. The 300,000-year-old assemblage from KM4 shows different characteristics. While still broadly Acheulean, the tools display manufacturing techniques not seen in the earlier assemblage. The makers used a different flaking strategy, produced more refined implements, and appear to have been more selective about raw materials. These differences suggest this was a different population, possibly entering Arabia from a different source area or representing evolved technological traditions from the same general population. Around 200,000 years ago, a dramatic shift occurred in Arabian stone technology. Tools from this period show early application of levallois technique, sophisticated method where the maker carefully prepares a stone core to produce flakes of predetermined size and shape. Unlike earlier techniques, where tool shape emerged gradually through reduction, levallois manufacturing involves extensive core preparation followed by removal of a few highly standardized flakes. This represents a cognitive leap. The tool exists first as an idea, and the manufacturing process is deliberately structured to realize that idea. The appearance of levallois technique in Arabia is significant because it marks technological modernity. While Neanderthals and early modern humans both used this technique, its presence indicates populations with advanced cognitive abilities and sophisticated cultural traditions. The timing around 200,000 years ago corresponds with the period when anatomically modern Homo sapiens was evolving in Africa. Whether the Arabian levallois tools were made by early sapiens, by Neanderthals pushing south from Eurasia, or by other advanced hominins remains debated, but the sophistication is undeniable. The 130,000 to 75,000-year-old assemblage shows even greater complexity. Multiple tool types appear levallois points clearly intended as spear tips, specialized scrapers for hide processing, distinctive notch tools called denticulates whose function remains debated. The diversity suggests specialized toolkits adapted for specific tasks. This specialization indicates populations that had moved beyond generalized stone technology toward craft differentiation and task-specific tool optimization. Most intriguing is the 55,000-year-old assemblage, which shows characteristics matching both African Middle Stone Age and Eurasian Middle Paleolithic traditions. Some tools look decidedly African in design, while others resemble implements found in Levantine sites associated with Neanderthals. This mixing might indicate contact between different populations in Arabia, cultural exchange, or simply convergent evolution of similar solutions to similar problems. Whatever the explanation, it demonstrates that Arabia wasn't a simple corridor, but a crossroads where different traditions met. The raw materials used for tools provide another layer of information. Petrographic analysis, microscopic examination of stone composition, allows identification of source areas. High-quality flint from specific geological formations can be fingerprinted and traced to origins sometimes hundreds of kilometers from where finished tools are found. This movement of stone documents exchange networks, territorial ranges, and strategic material procurement. At some Arabian sites, over 80% of tools are made from non-local materials, indicating extensive transport. This wasn't casual. Moving 10 kilograms of stone across 100 kilometers of desert requires deliberate planning. It suggests humans identified superior raw material sources during favorable seasons when travel was feasible, stockpiled materials, and transported them back to occupied areas. This forward planning and logistical organization represents sophisticated economic behavior. Tool manufacturing sites themselves tell stories. Some locations show evidence of intensive knapping, thick deposits of flakes, cores, and manufacturing debris, indicating repeated tool production over extended periods. These workshop sites often occur near high-quality stone sources. Other sites show only finished tools and minimal debris, suggesting people manufactured tools at workshops, then transported finished products elsewhere for use. This spatial separation of manufacture and use indicates organized technological systems. The learning required to master stone tool manufacture was substantial. Modern experimental archaeologists spend months or years learning to competently produce Levallois flakes, and even then rarely achieve the skill level evident in prehistoric tools. This expertise wasn't innate. It was learned through observation, practice, and instruction from skilled practitioners. The existence of complex tool traditions, persisting across generations, requires social learning mechanisms, teaching, and cultural systems for knowledge transmission. Some sites show evidence of what archaeologists call learning debitage, manufacturing debris suggesting novice toolmakers practicing skills. These include incomplete attempts, tools with obvious mistakes, and large quantities of debris relative to finished products. The presence of learning debris indicates that tool manufacture happened in social contexts where skilled and unskilled practitioners worked together, enabling knowledge transfer across generations. Tool hafting, attaching stone points to wooden or bone handles, appears in the archaeological record during this period, though direct evidence is rare because organic materials rarely preserve. The shapes of some stone tools make sense only as hafted implements. They have tangs or modified bases that would be awkward to handhold but perfect for insertion into handles. Hafting greatly increases tool effectiveness and represents another technological advance requiring planning, multi-material processing, and adhesive manufacture. Regional variation in tool styles raises questions about cultural identity and group boundaries. When populations make tools differently, despite having access to similar materials and facing similar challenges, it suggests cultural traditions, not environmental constraints, driving variation. These cultural differences might have marked group boundaries. We make tools this way. They make them that way, serving as markers of identity in the same way language, dress, or customs do in modern societies. The question of whether different tool traditions represent different hominin species is hotly debated. Some researchers argue that dramatically different manufacturing techniques indicate cognitive differences significant enough to represent different species. Others argue that modern human populations show comparable technological diversity despite being single species. So tool variation alone doesn't prove multiple species. Without hominin fossils directly associated with each tool assemblage, the debate continues. What's undeniable is that multiple distinct populations crossed Arabia over hundreds of thousands of years, each bringing different technologies, each successful in their time. Whether these were all the same species with different cultures or different species with different cognitive capabilities, they all solved the problem of desert crossing. They all recognized green Arabia opportunities, navigated to water sources, hunted megafauna, and survived long enough to leave archaeological signatures we can read 400,000 years later. The stone tools of Arabia are messages across time, encoded in rock by hands-long dust, telling us that the desert wastelands weren't barriers but crossroads. They tell us that human ingenuity, human adaptability, human determination to explore and expand drove multiple populations to attempt a crossing. They tell us that success was unguaranteed. The abandonment of sites when climate shifted reminds us that failure was always possible. But they also tell us that humans kept trying, kept adapting, kept learning, and ultimately succeeded in ways that shaped the entire trajectory of our species. Chapter 6. Footprints in Time. A day at the lake 120,000 years ago, the discovery was almost accidental. In 2017, archaeologist Professor Nick Drake was surveying an ancient lake deposit in the Nafut Desert, searching for fossils and stone tools, when he noticed something extraordinary: large impressions in hardened sediment that looked suspiciously like footprints. Later that day, His colleague Clint Janulus confirmed what Drake suspected. Scattered among the animal tracks were human footprints, fossilized in place 120,000 years ago. This was the site of Elathar, and these prints would tell one of the most intimate stories of ancient human life ever recovered from Arabia. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. It's 120,000 years ago during a warm period between ice ages. The Nefa Desert as we know it doesn't exist instead. Grasslands stretch to horizons, dotted with acacia trees and punctuated by a substantial lake. The water is fresh, fed by seasonal rains and perhaps underground springs. Around the lake's margins, mud created perfect conditions for preserving footprints, sticky enough to capture impressions, but firm enough that they held shape as the lake. Dried in sun hardened the sediment before wind or water destroyed the tracks. The human footprints tell a specific story. Analysis shows they were made by a small group, probably 2 to 3 individuals, possibly including adolescents based on foot sizes. They weren't running, but walking at normal pace, heading directly toward the lake from one direction, then dispersing slightly as they reached the water's edge. The pattern suggests purposeful movement, a deliberate trip to the lake, probably for water procurement, but perhaps also for foraging or simply as a comfortable rest stop during longer journey. The depth and clarity of the prints indicate the mud was quite wet when the humans walked through, probably recent rainfall, and left the shoreline particularly soft. Foot morphology visible in the clearest prints matches modern human anatomy, full arch, heel strike pattern, and toe positioning all indicate Homo sapiens, not archaic hominins. This was early modern humans, our direct ancestors, taking a break at a desert oasis that wouldn't exist again for thousands of years after the climate shifted back to aridity. But the human tracks weren't alone. Scattered across the same ancient surface are footprints from a menagerie of animals that modern visitors to Arabia would find astonishing. Elephant tracks, huge circular impressions from 3-toed feet mark where these giants approached the water to drink. Their path shows they came from different direction than the humans, converging on the lake from surrounding landscape. The size variation suggests a mixed herd including adults and younger animals. Camel tracks appear in profusion, though these weren't domestic camels, but their wild ancestors. The footprints show they moved in groups, following each other in lines, behavior characteristic of modern camels navigating terrain. Buffalo tracks, deep, split-hooved impressions indicate substantial herds of these water-dependent bovines. Their presence, like the hippos found at other sites, proves permanent water existed here, not just seasonal flooding. Horse tracks crisscross the exposed surface, showing these fleet grazers were abundant. Some tracks appear hurried long strides, suggesting running or trotting, while others show leisurely walking. The variation indicates horses use this area extensively for drinking, feeding, and probably fleeing from predators. The presence of large predators is implied, though not directly evidenced. With so much prey, carnivores certainly hunted this landscape. The relationship between human and animal tracks raises fascinating questions. Did the humans see these animals? Almost certainly fresh tracks would have been visible, and the animals themselves probably present at the lake. Did the humans hunt any of these species? Quite possibly, they carried tools, stone tools found at the site, and had the capability. Did the animals fear humans? This is harder to answer, but the casual mixing of tracks suggests animals weren't fleeing human approach, at least not frantically. The timing of this brief scene can be constrained remarkably precisely. The footprints were made when the lake was in late stages of drying. Water levels had dropped, exposing mudflats that were normally underwater. Seasonal lake level fluctuations in arid regions typically occur as dry seasons progress after rainy periods. The mud consistency suggests recent rainfall followed by several days of drying under hot sun. This scenario places the event in late dry season or early rainy season transition, a specific few weeks in the annual cycle. The preservation of these tracks required precise conditions. If the mud dried too slowly, tracks would have been destroyed by subsequent traffic animals, wind, or rain. If it dried too quickly before being well formed, impressions would have been too shallow to preserve. If the lake refilled before tracks were fossilized, they would have been obliterated. Instead, the mud dried at just the right rate, sun-baked the surface hard, and wind-blown sand quickly buried the prints, protecting them through 120,000 years of climate change, wind erosion, and landscape evolution. What happened next at Alathur? The footprints represent a single moment, but the site contains more. Stone tools found in the same sediment layers show humans visited this area repeatedly, not just once. The tools include Levallois flakes characteristic of Middle Paleolithic technology, confirming the sophistication of these populations. The lake itself persisted for perhaps decades or centuries before the climate shifted. The rains failed and the water disappeared. The humans who made these footprints, what were they thinking as they approached the lake? Were they members of a larger group camped nearby, sent to fetch water in skin bags or ostrich eggshells? Were they scouts exploring the region, assessing resources for their band? Were they refugees from less favorable areas, desperately seeking water during drought? We can't know their thoughts, but we can know they succeeded. They found water. They survived this day, and presumably they lived on to have descendants who eventually populated the globe. The emotional resonance of footprints exceeds that of stone tools or even skeletal remains. Tools are made objects, bones are what remains after death, but footprints capture living action. These are traces of humans in motion, walking, perhaps talking to each other, certainly alert to their surroundings in landscape full of dangerous animals. They were people, not so different from us, solving the same problems, finding water, avoiding danger, navigating unknown terrain, to challenge any human in wilderness. Archaeologists working at Alathur note the site's strategic location. It sits along what would have been a major travel corridor, a natural route between Africa and Eurasia during wet periods when vegetation and water made passage feasible. The footprints might record travelers on long journey, not permanent residents. This makes sense given the transient nature of Green Arabia populations would have moved through the peninsula during favorable periods, establishing temporary camps but not permanent settlements. Comparative analysis with other footprint sites worldwide provides context. Human footprints are rare in archaeological record. They require specific preservation conditions that rarely occur. When found, they provide unmatched temporal resolution, capturing moments rather than accumulated palimpsests. The Alathur prints join famous examples like the Latoli footprints in Tanzania, 3.6 million years old, made by Australopithecus, or the Wallandra Lakes prints in Australia, 20,000 years old, made by modern humans. Each tells a unique story of specific individuals in specific moments. The animal tracks at Alathur provide independent evidence confirming paleoenvironmental reconstructions from other sources. The species present, elephants, buffalo, wild horses, all require specific habitat conditions. Their presence at this single location proves the landscape supported diverse megafauna. Vegetation was substantial, and water was permanent during this period. This ground truth from actual biological presence complements the geological and climatic evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of Green Arabia ecology. For modern researchers, sites like Alathur are frustratingly incomplete and tantalizingly specific simultaneously. We know more about what happened in those few hours when footprints were made than we know about thousands of years of human presence in Arabia for which we have only scattered stone tools. But those few hours can't answer the bigger questions. How long did these populations persist? Did they successfully cross all the way to Asia or die out in Arabia? What cultural practices, beliefs, and social organizations characterize them? The footprints provoke questions they can't answer. Yet the power of Alether lies precisely in what it does provide, a human moment preserved across 120,000 years. It tells us that during one of the windows when Arabia was green, when lakes dotted landscapes now buried under sand dunes, humans were there. They walked the same ground where elephants walked, drank from the same waters buffalo drank from, and gazed at the same sky we now see when visiting this site. The Alether footprints aren't just scientific data, they're a connection across time. In a discipline often dealing with statistical patterns and aggregate behaviors, here we have individuals. 2 or 3 people, probably young, walking to water on a day that might have seemed unremarkable to them but which we can reconstruct in surprising detail. 120 millennia later, they left these prints unknowingly, never imagining that in the distant future, other humans would find them and wonder about their lives. When excavations concluded at Alether, researchers carefully documented and preserved the footprints. Some were lifted as blocks for museum display, others left in situ but protected. This ensures that future visitors and researchers can see these traces can stand where ancient humans stood and can reflect on the long journey our species has taken from those shores of a long-vanished lake to the globally distributed, technologically sophisticated populations we've become. Chapter 7. The Drying Death. Surviving when green turned brown. 1,620 words. The transformation from paradise to wasteland didn't happen overnight, but in human terms, it happened fast. Green Arabia events lasted thousands of years, long enough for dozens of human generations to be born, live, and die knowing only grasslands and lakes. Then the climate shifted. Rainfall decreased. Lakes shrank, then dried. Grasslands browned, then disappeared. Rivers stopped flowing. And humans faced a choice: adapt to increasingly harsh conditions, migrate out of the region, or die. The archaeological record documents this recurring tragedy with painful clarity. Every occupation layer at sites like KAM4 terminates abruptly. Tools and animal bones simply stop appearing in sediments. Desert sands and wind-blown dust replace the lake deposits and organic-rich soils. The gaps between occupation layers span tens of thousands of years, the long arid periods when Arabia was uninhabitable. What happened to the people who had lived there? Climate proxy data from the region provides the environmental context. Cave deposits in Arabia preserve mineral formations called speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites, whose growth requires water seeping through rock, dissolving minerals, then precipitating them at cave interiors. When rainfall is adequate, speleothems grow actively. When drought comes, growth ceases, leaving distinct gaps in the mineral record. These gaps correspond perfectly with archaeological abandonment periods, confirming that water availability was critical constraint. Climate proxy data from the region provides the environmental context. Cave deposits in Arabia preserve mineral formations called speleothems, stalactites, and stalagmites, whose growth requires water seeping through rock, dissolving minerals, then precipitating them in cave interiors. When rainfall is adequate, speleothems grow actively. When drought comes, growth ceases, leaving distinct gaps in the mineral record. These gaps correspond perfectly with archaeological abandonment periods, confirming that water availability was critical constraint. Climate proxy data from the region provides the environmental context. Cave deposits in Arabia preserve mineral formations called speleothems, stalactites, and stalagmites, whose growth requires water seeping through rock, dissolving minerals, then precipitating them in cave interiors. When rainfall is adequate, speleothems grow actively. When drought comes, growth ceases, leaving distinct gaps in the mineral record. These gaps correspond perfectly with archaeological abandonment periods, confirming that water availability was critical constraint. The transition from wet to dry wasn't gradual shift of equal decreases each year. Climate records show that aridification happened in pulses years of near-normal rainfall, interrupted by drought years, with drought becoming progressively more frequent and severe until permanent aridity established. This variable decline would have been psychologically and strategically challenging. Good years would have encouraged people to stay, to believe conditions might stabilize. Drought years would have stressed populations, but not yet fatally. By the time it became clear the climate had permanently shifted, options for survival had already narrowed. Early warning signs would have been visible to observant populations. Lake levels dropping year after year despite seasonal rains. Vegetation changes as moisture-loving species died out and drought-resistant species increased. Animal migrations as megafauna moved toward remaining water sources or left the region entirely. Increased dust storms as vegetation loss exposed soil to wind erosion. These signals provided information about environmental trajectory, but recognizing the difference between temporary drought and permanent climate shift was difficult, especially for populations with lifespans of only 30 to 40 years. Some groups probably attempted to persist through early stages of aridification by adjusting subsistence strategies. As large game became scarce, they would have relied more heavily on smaller animals, gazelle, hares, birds. As lakes dried, they would have exploited remaining water sources more intensively, perhaps digging wells to access dropping water tables. As plant foods declined, they would have widened the range of species consumed, accepting lower quality foods previously ignored. These adaptations bought time but couldn't overcome fundamental water scarcity. Archaeological evidence from the transition periods is frustratingly scarce, exactly when we most like to see human responses to climate stress. The record goes quiet. This absence itself is informative. It suggests populations declined rapidly once critical thresholds were crossed. Small, stressed populations leave less archaeological trace than large, thriving ones. People moving frequently in search of resources occupy sites briefly, accumulating little debris. The scarcity of transitional evidence implies these weren't gradual regional abandonments, but relatively rapid population crashes. Where did they go? 3 possibilities exist. Each probably occurred in different times and places. First, populations retreated to neighboring regions that remained habitable back toward Africa, northward to the Levant, eastward toward Iranian highlands. Second, populations concentrated near the few remaining water sources in Arabia, attempting to survive on drastically reduced territory. Third, populations died out victims of starvation, dehydration, or conflicts over diminishing resources. Evidence for retreat exists in the form of archaeological continuity in adjacent regions. While Arabian sites show abandonment, sites in the Levant, Horn of Africa, and other peripheral areas show continued occupation. Some tool traditions from late Green Arabia periods show similarities with contemporaneous traditions in these refuge areas, suggesting populations maintained connections or migrated between regions as conditions changed. These weren't isolated populations, but parts of larger metapopulations distributed across Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa. The concentration of remaining water sources probably occurred, but is hard to detect archaeologically. If humans clustered near the few springs or deep wells that maintained water through droughts, these concentrated populations would have intensively exploited limited areas, potentially degrading resources through overuse. Such concentration would have increased disease transmission, elevated social tensions, and created conditions for violent conflict. Some abandoned sites show evidence of rapid departures, complete toolkits left behind, suggesting people fled suddenly rather than organizing careful migrations. Population die-offs almost certainly occurred. When resource bases collapse faster than populations can adjust, mortality spikes. The young and old die first, and the sick and injured. Eventually, even healthy adults succumb to starvation or dehydration. Skeletal evidence of nutritional stress during these periods would be valuable, but is rare. Human remains don't preserve well in arid environments, and populations in crisis don't conduct elaborate burials. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but the silence is deafening. The psychological toll of environmental collapse on surviving populations must have been severe. Imagine watching the landscape you've known all your life slowly dying. The lake where you learned to swim drying to cracked mud. The grasslands where herds graze turning to dust. Friends and relatives dying from thirst, starvation, or violence over dwindling resources. The trauma would have been profound, potentially encoded in cultural memory, stories, and perhaps even religious beliefs about paradise lost and the capriciousness of nature. Some groups may have attempted to manage the declining resources through social innovations. Water rationing systems, territorial agreements about access rights, conflicts to exclude outsiders from scarce resources. All these responses are documented in modern societies facing resource scarcity. Whether prehistoric populations had social organizations sophisticated enough to implement such strategies is debatable, but the cognitive capacity certainly existed. The question is whether social institutions were developed enough to coordinate collective responses to crisis. Intergroup conflict probably intensified during resource declines. When resources are abundant, groups can avoid each other or share peacefully. When resources are scarce, competition becomes zero-sum. One group's gain is another's loss. Archaeological evidence of interpersonal violence increases during many periods of environmental stress globally. While direct evidence from Arabia is limited, the pattern seen elsewhere suggests conflict was likely part of the drying period story. The timescales involved create particular challenges for understanding human responses. The complete transition from green Arabia to full desert conditions might have spanned 1,000 to 2,000 years. That's 30 to 60 human generations, long enough that no individual experienced both conditions, but short enough that cultural memory might have preserved information about former times. Did stories pass down through generations about when the land was green and water was abundant? Such stories appear in many cultures and may encode genuine historical memory. Adaptation to increasing aridity required technological innovation. Some late-period sites show evidence of water storage. Containers, possibly ostrich eggshells or other vessels, suggesting populations developed ways to transport and store water as sources became scattered. Improvements in hunting technology might have helped populations efficiently target remaining game. More sophisticated processing of plant foods could have extracted nutrition from marginal species. But technology could only compensate so much for fundamental environmental degradation. The survivors, those who successfully migrated out before conditions became fatal, carried with them experiences that shaped subsequent generations. They knew that landscapes change, that abundant regions can become desolate, that survival requires flexibility and preparedness for environmental instability. This knowledge, transmitted through stories, teachings, and cultural practices, may have made subsequent generations more adaptable, more willing to migrate when conditions deteriorated, more prepared for environmental challenges. Modern paleoclimate research reveals that the green to brown transitions happened repeatedly, not just in Arabia, but globally during the Pleistocene. Populations across Africa, Eurasia, and eventually the Americas faced similar challenges as climate oscillated between hospitable and hostile conditions. The Arabian case is particularly well documented, but it represents a pattern that characterized human existence for hundreds of thousands of years. Our species evolved in environments of dramatic instability, and that instability shaped our psychology, our technology, and our cultures in profound ways. There is bitter irony in the fact that the very climate changes that periodically opened Arabia to human occupation also periodically killed those populations. The green windows that made the crossing possible were temporary, and their end was inevitable. Populations that successfully crossed Arabia during favorable periods were gambling that they could reach other habitable regions before conditions collapsed. Those who lingered too long paid the ultimate price. The archaeological silence of the long arid periods, the tens of thousands of years between green Arabia events when no human traces appear, testifies to the completeness of the transformation. Not a few hardy groups struggling on, but complete absence of human presence. The desert reclaimed the wastelands, erasing all but the faintest traces of those who had briefly called them home. Only when the climate shifted again, when the rains returned, when grasslands spread and lakes filled, did humans return. New populations, often with different technologies and traditions, attempting the same crossing, facing eventually the same fate when green turned brown once more. Chapter 8. Children of Two Worlds. Families on the move. Imagine being a child growing up during a green Arabia event 200,000 years ago. You're born near a substantial lake, spend your early years playing along its shores, learning to identify edible plants, watching adults hunt megafauna. The landscape feels permanent, unchanging. Then, as you enter adolescence, you notice changes. Adults speak worriedly about shrinking water levels. Herds of animals that always grazed nearby have moved away. The rainy season brings less rain each year. By the time you have children of your own, the decision has been made. The group must leave, must migrate to regions where water still flows and plants still grow. Children were present during these migrations, that's certain. The footprints of Alather include smaller prints suggesting adolescents or young adults. Population biology requires children for group persistence, and the multi-generational occupation of Arabian sites proves reproductive success. But children fundamentally complicated migration. They slowed travel, required carrying, needed more frequent food and water, were more vulnerable to environmental stresses, and were less capable of the complex reasoning required for navigation and environmental assessment. The presence of children during desert crossings reveals several things immediately. First, these weren't exploratory expeditions by small groups of young males. They were population movements, including families, elderly, and juveniles. Second, groups were confident enough in their route knowledge and resource locations to risk children's lives on the journey. Third, the potential payoff, reaching better territory, was worth the risks, suggesting conditions in departure areas had become untenable. Fourth, successful crossings with children required careful planning, adequate resources, and probably experienced guides who knew routes and water sources. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer mobility provide insights into how families with children manage long-distance movement. Children under 4 are typically carried by mothers or other adults. From 4 to 8, children can walk but cover shorter distances than adults, requiring frequent rest stops. By 8 to 12, most children can match adult walking pace for extended periods. These age-related capabilities would have constrained group travel speed and daily distance. A group with multiple young children might cover only 10 to 15 kilometers daily, compared to 25 to 30 kilometers for groups of only adults. The metabolic demands of children during migration were substantial. Children require proportionally more calories per kilogram of body weight than adults and have less metabolic efficiency. Dehydration affects children more quickly due to their higher surface area to volume ratios. Heat stress impacts children faster. These vulnerabilities meant that routes successful for adult-only groups might be fatal for family groups. Water source spacing, shade availability, and travel timing all became more critical when children were present. Food acquisition during migrations would have been challenging. Adults could survive days without food if necessary, relying on fat stores. Children, with less reserves, needed more frequent feeding. Nursing infants required mothers to maintain adequate milk production, which demands extra maternal caloric intake. Weaned toddlers needed soft, easily digestible foods that might not be available in all environments. Successfully provisioning children during months-long migrations required either carrying substantial stored food, finding resources along routes, or both. The question arises, did groups deliberately time migrations to exclude children? Leaving vulnerable members behind is repellent to modern sensibilities, but might have seemed pragmatic to people facing resource collapse. However, archaeological evidence doesn't support this hypothesis. The presence of complete toolkits and diverse artifact assemblages at Arabian sites suggests complete populations, not selected subgroups. Furthermore, abandoning children would doom group reproductive futures. More likely, groups migrated as complete units, accepting slower travel and increased risks in exchange for maintaining family bonds and reproductive capacity. Child mortality during migrations was probably substantial. Dehydration, heat stroke, injuries, predation, infectious diseases, and malnutrition all would have claimed victims. The absence of elaborate burial sites along presumed migration routes might suggest that deceased children couldn't be mourned with extensive ceremony time, and resource pressures required groups to continue moving. This doesn't mean deaths weren't grieved, but practical necessity limited memorial practices. The psychological toll of losing children during migrations must have been devastating for families. Social organization around child care during migrations likely involved collective responsibility. Multiple adults would have shared carrying burden, rotating toddlers among carriers to prevent exhaustion. Older children would have helped watch younger ones. Grandmothers past reproductive age would have been particularly valuable, having experience with child rearing and not being slowed by pregnancy or nursing. This grandmother hypothesis, that post-reproductive females provided fitness benefits through helping raise grandchildren, may have been especially important during resource-stress migrations. Education continued during migrations, perhaps intensified. Children needed to learn survival skills, urgently identifying water sources, recognizing edible and poisonous plants, navigating by landmarks and celestial cues, avoiding dangers. Travel itself became education, as adults pointed out features of importance and explained their significance. Children who paid attention and learned well increased their survival chances. Those who didn't risked fatal mistakes. The psychological impact on children of leaving known territories for unknown destinations must have been profound. Children form attachments to places. Familiar landscapes provide security and comfort. Being uprooted and marched across unfamiliar, hostile terrain would have been frightening. How did parents help children cope with this stress? Probably through the same means humans always use: reassurance, explanations about why the journey was necessary, promises of better conditions ahead, stories and games to distract from hardships, and above all, maintain family bonds that provided emotional security, even in physical insecurity. Some children born during Green Arabia periods may never have known any other life. If families lived in Arabia for generations during wet periods, children's entire experience would have been Arabian landscapes. When forced to migrate as climate dried, they weren't returning to ancestral homelands, but fleeing to regions as unfamiliar as Arabia had been to their grandparents. This generational disconnect from original homelands might have created cultural adaptations, identities based on mobility itself rather than attachment to specific places. The physical demands of migration shaped child development. Walking long distances daily built endurance and physical strength. Exposure to varied terrain developed balance and coordination. The necessity of constant alertness to dangers honed observational skills. In some ways, children who survived arduous migrations may have emerged physically and psychologically tougher than children raised in more stable environments. This was an advantage without cost. The mortality toll was real, but survivors carried forward traits and skills useful in unstable Pleistocene environments. Birth rates during migrations probably declined. The physical stress of travel, reduced caloric intake, and dehydration all negatively impact female fertility. Women who became pregnant during migrations faced increased risks of pregnancy complications, difficulties during labor without stable camp settings, and the challenge of caring for newborns while traveling. Groups probably tried to time migrations to avoid birthing seasons when possible, but climate changes didn't accommodate human reproductive cycles. Births during migrations surely occurred, adding another layer of complexity to already challenging journeys. The role of play during migrations deserves consideration. Children engage in play even under difficult conditions. It's fundamental to child psychology and development. During rest stops, children would have played, and their play probably incorporated elements of the journey: pretend hunting, mock water searches, games involving navigation or identification of resources. This play wasn't frivolous, but served to process experiences, practice skills, and maintain emotional well-being despite hardships. Adolescents occupy unique positions during migrations. Too old to require carrying but not yet fully adult, they could contribute significantly to group survival. Adolescents could help carry supplies, watch younger children, scout ahead for resources, and assist with hunting and gathering. Their physical capabilities approached adult levels while they still had energy and enthusiasm of youth. Successful migrations may have served as rites of passage, transforming adolescents into recognized adults through demonstrated capability under extreme conditions. The intergenerational transmission of knowledge during migrations was crucial for success. Elders who had previously crossed Arabia during earlier favorable periods, or who had learned from their elders about previous crossings, carried vital information about routes, water sources, and survival strategies. This knowledge couldn't be written down, but had to be remembered and communicated. Children who paid attention during migrations, who listened to elder stories and explanations, who observed and learned, became the knowledge carriers for next generations. The survival of groups across multiple climate cycles depended on this cultural memory transmission. Family bonds may have strengthened during migrations through shared hardship. Modern research on disaster psychology shows that shared adversity often creates strong social bonds and group cohesion. Families that successfully crossed Arabia together would have forged connections through mutual dependency and shared experience. These strengthened bonds might have provided social capital for years afterward, creating tight-knit communities bound by common origin stories and shared trauma. The success of family migrations across Arabia ultimately testifies to human adaptability and the power of social bonds. It would have been easier, safer, and faster to migrate without children. But humans aren't purely pragmatic calculators optimizing for efficiency. We're social beings who maintain family units even at personal cost. The fact that populations successfully crossed Arabia with children in tow repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years demonstrates that human social organization could overcome formidable environmental challenges. Children weren't impediments to migration, but integral parts of the human communities that crossed the desert wastelands. Chapter 9. The Crossroads Effect. Where Africa Met Eurasia, 1,600 words. Arabia wasn't just a corridor. It was a crossroads where populations from different continents, different evolutionary lineages, and different cultural traditions encountered each other. The peninsula's unique position as the only land bridge between Africa and Eurasia meant that during Green Arabia events, populations moving in different directions potentially met, interacted, and influenced each other. This crossroads effect makes Arabia archaeologically fascinating and evolutionarily significant. The evidence for multi-directional movement is clear in the archaeological record. Stone tool assemblages from Arabia show influences from both African and Eurasian traditions. Some tools look decidedly African and design Middle Stone Age technologies, similar to those found in East Africa during the same periods. Other tools resemble Eurasian Middle Paleolithic implements associated with Neanderthal populations. Still others show characteristics unique to Arabia, suggesting either local innovation or blending of traditions from multiple sources. Consider the implications. If populations from Africa were moving north into Arabia, while populations from Eurasia were moving south, they would have encountered each other. These weren't necessarily the same species anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolving in Africa versus Neanderthals established in Eurasia, with the possibility of other archaic hominins also present. What happened when they met? Did they avoid each other, fight, trade, or interbreed? Genetic evidence from modern human populations proves that interbreeding occurred between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Most modern humans of non-African ancestry carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. This admixture happened somewhere in Western Asia, probably including the Levant and possibly Arabia, between roughly 60,000 and 100,000 years ago. The crossroads provided opportunities for biological exchange that shaped the genetic makeup of all subsequent human populations. But genetic exchange isn't the only or even the most important type of interaction. Cultural exchange, the transmission of technologies, knowledge, and practices between groups, could occur without interbreeding. A group observing another's superior tool-making technique might adopt it. Information about water sources, edible plants, or hunting strategies could be shared through trade or simple observation. Even hostile interactions provide information about other populations' capabilities and strategies. The animal fossil record parallels the human pattern, showing species from both African and Eurasian origins meeting in Arabia during wet periods. Elephants of African affinities coexisted with horses more characteristic of Eurasian grasslands. Hippos, quintessentially African, shared water sources with species that evolved in Eurasia. This faunal mixing demonstrates that Arabia during green events functioned as biogeographic intersection, not isolated corridor. Species flowed in both directions, creating hybrid ecosystems combining elements from two continents. Archaeological site distribution suggests that different populations may have preferentially occupied different niches within green Arabia. Some sites cluster near major lakes and desert interiors, while others appear along upland margins. Some areas show predominantly African-style tools. Others show more Eurasian characteristics. This spatial segregation might indicate that different populations occupied Arabia simultaneously, but maintained some separation, perhaps through territorial arrangements or habitat preferences. The question of competition versus cooperation between populations is difficult to answer from archaeological evidence alone. Competition seems likely. Groups with similar resource needs occupying the same region would naturally compete for water, game, and territory. But cooperation was also possible. Different groups might have specialized in different resources or occupied different seasons, reducing direct competition. Trade and information exchange provided benefits that might have outweighed competitive disadvantages. Language differences would have complicated interactions. If populations from Africa and Eurasia spoke different languages, almost certain given the time depths involved, communication would have been difficult. Yet humans are remarkably good at improvising communication through gesture, demonstration, and pidgin languages. The presence of similar stone tool technologies across wide areas suggests that complex technical information was transmitted between groups somehow, requiring at least limited communication capability. The social structures of encountering populations might have influenced interaction outcomes. If both groups were patrilical, males stay in birth group, females move to other groups at marriage, then female exchange could have created kinship links between groups. If one group was more hierarchical and the other more egalitarian, power dynamics might have favored particular interaction patterns. Without direct evidence of social organization, these remain speculations. But social structure surely influenced how populations related to each other. Conflict evidence is frustratingly absent from the Arabian record, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Skeletal remains with trauma could indicate violence, but human remains are exceptionally rare in Arabian sites. Fortified sites or defensive features would suggest conflict, but nothing of the sort has been identified from this period. The stone tools themselves, primarily cutting and scraping implements, don't show obvious weapons design, though any sharpened point can serve as weapon. Conflict may have occurred without leaving clear archaeological signature. The genetic evidence of Neanderthal sapiens interbreeding indicates that at least some interactions were peaceful enough for reproductive encounters. Whether this represents consensual relationships, capture of females, or other dynamics is unknowable, but the outcome viable hybrid offspring who survived to reproduce demonstrates that biological barriers between species weren't absolute. Cultural and behavioral differences may have been more significant barriers than genetics. Rock art from later periods in Arabia shows human figures in various activities, sometimes in groups, occasionally in apparent interaction scenes. While none of this art dates to the earliest crossroads periods, it demonstrates that by later prehistory, Arabian peoples were depicting human social interactions as important enough to memorialize in art. This cultural significance of intergroup relations may have deep roots. The crossroads effect had evolutionary consequences beyond simple gene flow. Populations encountering others with different technologies and strategies had opportunities to observe alternatives to their own practices. This exposure to diversity may have stimulated innovation. Seeing another group's superior hunting technique might inspire attempts to replicate or improve upon it. Cultural evolution accelerates when populations interact and exchange information, and Arabia provided ideal conditions for such exchange. Environmental knowledge shared across populations would have been particularly valuable. A group from Africa familiar with certain plant species might teach others about their uses. A group from Eurasia experienced with cold weather survival might share relevant techniques. While desert survival itself required locally specific knowledge, general principles and transferable skills could spread through intergroup contact. The archaeological record hints at this through the appearance of technologies in regions where they hadn't previously existed, suggesting transmission rather than independent invention. The question of whether Arabia served as speciation zone, a place where populations diverged into separate species, versus hybridization zone, where separate species merged, is actively debated. Some researchers argue that the isolation of populations in Arabia during green periods, followed by reconnection during subsequent events, could have driven diversification. Others argue that the repeated mixing of populations from different source areas prevented speciation by maintaining gene flow. The truth probably varies by time period and specific populations involved. Arabia's role as crossroads extended beyond the Pleistocene. In later periods, the peninsula continued serving as junction for human movements, trade routes, and cultural exchanges. The incense trade routes of the ancient world, the spread of agriculture and pastoralism, the expansion of empires and religions, all involved movements through Arabia that echoed the ancient patterns of population dispersal during green events. In some sense, Arabia has always been a crossroads, and that role shaped human history across hundreds of thousands of years. Modern Saudi Arabia's position in global geopolitics, its role in energy markets, and its position as crossroads between East and West echoes these ancient patterns. While the specific factors have changed dramatically, petroleum reserves rather than freshwater lakes, air travel rather than foot migrations, the fundamental geographic reality remains. Arabia sits at the junction of continents, and whoever controls that junction holds strategic advantages. Our ancient ancestors understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it in such terms. They knew that Arabia was where worlds met. The archaeological work in Arabia over the past 2 decades has fundamentally changed our understanding of human evolution and dispersal. What was once thought to be an empty barrier region now appears as a dynamic crossroads where populations repeatedly met, mixed, and influenced each other. The stone tools, the fossils, the ancient lakes all tell a story of Arabia as connector, not divider, during crucial periods of human prehistory. The crossroads effect shaped who we became as a species, influencing our genetics, our technologies, and our capacity for encountering and learning from others different from ourselves. Chapter 10. Failed expansions. The ones who didn't make it for. Every successful crossing of Arabia documented in the archaeological record. There were probably multiple failures, populations that attempted the journey but didn't survive, groups that reached Arabia but couldn't establish sustainable presence, expansions that began promisingly but ended in local extinction. The archaeological record, by its nature, preferentially preserves success stories. Abandoned sites and disappeared populations leave fainter traces. Yet by reading between the lines, we can glimpse the failures that outnumbered successes. The genetic evidence for failed expansions is particularly revealing. Modern human genetic diversity shows clear patterns of bottlenecks periods when populations crashed to small numbers before recovering. Some of these bottlenecks occurred during attempts to expand out of Africa. Genetic studies suggest that while Homo sapiens existed in Africa for 200,000 years, successful global dispersal didn't occur until around 60,000 to 80,000 years ago. Earlier expansion attempts, including movements into the Levant around 120,000 years ago, evidenced by the skull and Kafse fossils, apparently failed to establish permanent populations outside Africa. What caused these failures? Climate is the most obvious culprit. The window of opportunity provided by Green Arabia events was limited. Groups that entered during favorable conditions but hadn't completed crossing before climate shifted back to aridity would have been trapped. Unable to reach Asia, unable to return to Africa across re-desertifying landscapes, they likely perished. The Skal and Kafse populations in the Levant may have met this fate-successful movement out of Africa during warm period around 120,000 years ago. But then regional extinction when climate cooled during subsequent glacial period. Archaeological gaps in the record support this interpretation. Sites occupied during Green Arabia events are followed by tens of thousands of years with no human presence clear, evidence of population disappearance. Whether these populations died out completely or retreated to refuge areas in Africa or Eurasia is often unclear. The silence in the record suggests that whatever happened, it resulted in complete abandonment of Arabia as habitat. Resource miscalculation might have doomed some groups. Imagine a population confidently moving into Arabia based on information about abundant resources, only to find conditions worse than expected. Perhaps they arrived as a green period was ending rather than beginning. Perhaps their information was outdated, based on previous favorable periods but no longer accurate. Perhaps they underestimated the distance between water sources or overestimated the carrying capacity of the land. Such errors would be fatal when retreat wasn't feasible. Disease could have played a role in failed expansions. Populations entering new environments encounter unfamiliar pathogens. Groups from Africa moving into Arabia during green periods would have faced disease-causing organisms from Eurasian species. Without prior exposure, they would have lacked immunity. Epidemic diseases spreading through expanding populations could have crushed numbers below viable levels. While direct evidence is lacking, pathogens rarely fossilize. The pattern of population disappearance is consistent with disease as contributing factor. Violence between competing groups may have ended some expansion attempts. If populations from Africa encountered established Neanderthal or other archaic human populations in Arabia or the Levant, conflicts could have occurred. Even without different species involved, competition between contemporary Homo sapiens groups over limited resources might have turned violent. Archaeological evidence for interpersonal violence in this period is sparse, but present some skeletal remains show trauma suggesting conflict. Failed expansions might have involved military defeat as much as environmental challenges. The demographic structure of expanding populations influenced success or failure. Small founding populations faced genetic problems, inbreeding depression, loss of genetic diversity, and vulnerability to random demographic fluctuations. If only a few dozen individuals crossed into Arabia, bad luck deaths from accidents, predation, or disease could have eliminated the entire group. Successful expansions probably required founder populations large enough to buffer against such random losses, perhaps several hundred individuals minimum. Social cohesion was another critical factor. Long, stressful journeys across harsh environments test group unity. Conflicts over leadership, resource distribution, or strategic decisions could have fractured groups. A divided population is less likely to survive environmental crises. Failed expansions might have resulted from social breakdown as much as environmental factors. Without written records, we can't document prehistoric social conflicts, but given human nature, they surely occurred and sometimes proved fatal to group survival. Technological limitations may have ended some expansions. Populations lacking crucial technologies, effective water storage containers, adequate shelter building skills, appropriate hunting tools for local game, would have been disadvantaged. Some groups might have ventured into Arabia with technological toolkits adequate for African environments, but insufficient for Arabian conditions. This mismatch between technology and environment could mean the difference between success and failure. Children and elderly members complicated expansions and may have tipped marginally viable groups into failure. The slower travel imposed by young children, the extra resource needs, the vulnerability to environmental stresses, all these factors reduced group mobility and resilience. Populations with high ratios of dependent members relative to productive adults would have struggled more than those with favorable demographic profiles. Failed expansions might disproportionately involve groups with challenging demographics. The question arises, did populations recognize when expansions were failing, and did they attempt returns to source areas? Retreat requires admitting failure, retracing difficult routes, and facing again the dangers already overcome. Pride and sunk-cost reasoning might have prevented retreats, even when rational. Alternatively, by the time failure became obvious, retreat might have been impossible. Climate may have shifted, making return routes impassable. The archaeological absence of clear retreat evidence suggests that failed populations usually did unsuccessfully return to starting points. Some failed expansions left no archaeological trace whatsoever because groups died before establishing occupation sites. Imagine a band attempting to cross Arabia during what they thought was a green period, but which was actually a briefer, less favorable climate pulse. They might have perished during the crossing, their remains scattered across desert landscapes where preservation is poor and discovery unlikely. Such complete failures would be invisible in the archaeological record, detectable only through absence genetic evidence of population bottlenecks without corresponding archaeological presence. The psychological toll of failed expansions on survivors who did manage retreat would have been severe. Watching companions die, abandoning the quest, returning to admit defeat, these experiences would have been traumatizing. Yet such survivors would have carried valuable information about what doesn't work, what dangers exist, and what strategies fail. This information, passed to future generations, might have improved subsequent expansion attempts. In this sense, failed expansions contributed to eventual successes by teaching lessons paid for in lives. Modern humans' eventual success in expanding globally suggests that failures were overcome through some combination of timing, technology, numbers, and luck. The expansion around 60,000 to 80,000 years ago succeeded where earlier attempts failed, establishing permanent populations throughout Asia and eventually reaching Australia, Europe, and the Americas. What was different? Possibly better tools, more sophisticated social organization, favorable climate alignment, larger founding populations, or simple chance. The archaeological and genetic records don't provide clear answers, leaving this crucial question open. The failures remind us that human expansion across the globe wasn't inevitable or predestined. It was a contingent process that could have played out differently. If all expansion attempts had failed, humans might have remained confined to Africa, evolving differently, never developing the global cultural diversity that characterizes our species. The failed expansions are counterfactual history incarnate, reminders of paths not taken, futures that didn't materialize, and the razor's edge between extinction and expansion that our ancestors walked. Honoring the failed expansions means acknowledging that the successful spread of humanity across the planet was built on countless individual and group tragedies. The archaeological sites we excavate, the success stories we tell, rest on foundation of disappeared populations who attempted the same journeys but didn't survive. Their bones lie unrecovered in desert sands, their stories untold except through absence. They were brave, adaptable, and capable, but also unlucky, poorly timed, or overwhelmed by challenges they couldn't overcome. They were us, and their failures make our existence possible by process of evolutionary selection that preserved successful strategies and eliminated unsuccessful ones. Chapter 11. Desert Wisdom. What the wasteland taught humanity. Stand in the Negev Desert today, and you see sand dunes, sparse vegetation, and a landscape that seems hostile to life. But beneath your feet lie the sediments of ancient lakes, the tools of vanished peoples, and the footprints of extinct megafauna. This layered history tells a story not just about past environments, but about what those environments taught humanity, lessons that shaped our species in profound and lasting ways. The first and most fundamental lesson was about environmental impermanence. Landscapes change. Today's paradise is tomorrow's wasteland, and vice versa. Early humans who crossed Arabia during green events, who lived through the transitions back to aridity, who saw lakes dry and grasslands turn to dust, learned viscerally that environments aren't static. This understanding of environmental dynamism shaped human cognition, making our species alert to environmental changes, skilled at reading landscape indicators, and psychologically prepared for environmental instability. This lesson contrasts with what sedentary agricultural societies later believed, that the land is stable, that farming the same ground year after year is viable, that investments in permanent structures make sense. The desert taught that permanence is illusion, that flexibility and mobility are survival traits, that being prepared to move is more important than being deeply rooted. While later human history involved increasing sedentism, the cognitive and cultural templates established during mobile phases in places like Arabia remained as psychological undercurrents. The second lesson was about water's absolute primacy. In environments where water is scarce and unpredictable, it becomes the organizing principle around which all other decisions orbit. Where is water? How much is available? How long will it last? What's the distance to the next source? These questions dominated planning and decision-making. The archaeological record shows this priority sites cluster near water. Routes connect water sources, and evidence suggests sophisticated water management, even in prehistoric times. This water-centered worldview shaped human cognition and culture in ways that persist. Many religions feature water as sacred element. Rituals involving water appear in cultures globally. Stories about floods, droughts, and the search for water pervade human mythologies. These cultural universals may trace back to prehistoric experiences in water-scarce environments where hydration truly was life or death critical. The desert taught water's value in ways that permeate human consciousness. The third lesson involved strategic timing, recognizing windows of opportunity and acting decisively when they opened. Green Arabia events were brief in geological terms, lasting thousands of years, but representing tiny fractions of overall time. Populations that recognized these windows and moved into Arabia during favorable periods succeeded. Those who missed opportunities, or who entered too late as favorable periods were ending, failed. This taught the importance of environmental monitoring, prediction, and swift action when conditions allowed. Human seasonal migration patterns, agricultural planting calendars, and trade voyage timing all reflect this lesson about strategic temporal planning. We're a species that tracks time, predicts cycles, and times actions to coincide with favorable conditions. While some animals show seasonal behaviors, humans develop this capacity to extraordinary degree, tracking multiple cycles simultaneously, predicting years ahead, and planning multi-generational strategies. The cognitive architecture supporting these abilities was sharpened through experiences like navigating Green Arabia windows. The fourth lesson concerned navigation and spatial cognition. Crossing deserts requires remembering landmark locations, maintaining directional orientation without constant visual cues, and integrating spatial information into coherent mental maps spanning hundreds of kilometers. The populations that successfully crossed Arabia couldn't have done so without sophisticated spatial cognitive abilities. The selection pressure for enhanced spatial cognition would have been intense. Groups with better navigators. The 12th lesson, one that emerges only when examining the full sweep of human desert interactions, concerns the relationship between stress and innovation. The desert wastelands weren't comfortable environments where leisurely experimentation produced gradual improvements. They were pressure cookers where innovation happened because it had to. Groups that couldn't innovate died. This harsh selection created a species for whom innovation under pressure became almost reflexive. Modern humans facing crises often respond with bursts of creativity and problem-solving, a trait likely honed in prehistoric environments that rewarded rapid innovation. Consider how quickly humans developed new technologies when environmental conditions demanded them. The specialized stone tools found at Arabian sites didn't exist centuries earlier. They were invented in response to specific challenges. The water storage technologies, the route-finding strategies, the social cooperation mechanisms all emerged from necessity. This pattern of crisis-driving innovation appears throughout human history, from the agricultural revolution during climate instability to the industrial revolution during resource pressures. The desert taught us that necessity truly is the mother of invention, and that lesson became encoded in human cultural evolution. The 13th lesson involves what psychologists might call grit or resilience, the capacity to persist through adversity, to continue attempting difficult goals despite setbacks, to maintain hope and effort when situations seem hopeless. The populations that successfully crossed Arabia faced countless setbacks. Water sources they expected to find were dry. Game they hoped to hunt had migrated. Routes they planned to follow were impassable. Members of their groups died, yet they persisted. They adapted. They found alternatives. This psychological resilience, this refusal to surrender in face of overwhelming challenges, distinguishes humans from many other species. Modern psychological research shows that resilience isn't fixed trait but learned capability. People develop resilience through experiencing and overcoming challenges, through seeing others model persistent behavior, and through cultural narratives that valorize perseverance. Our prehistoric ancestors crossing Arabia were developing this resilience in the most demanding classroom imaginable. Those who gave up died. Those who persisted had chances of surviving and passing on both genetic predispositions and cultural teachings about persistence. We inherited both the genes and the stories. The 14th lesson concerns mortality awareness and how confronting death shapes human consciousness. Desert crossings involved watching companions die from dehydration, from heat stroke, from predator attacks, from accidents, from disease. This intimate familiarity with death, this understanding that survival is never guaranteed, may have contributed to distinctively human concerns about mortality, meaning, and legacy. Many researchers argue that awareness of personal mortality drives much human behavior, our quest for meaning, our creation of art and religion, our desire to leave lasting impacts. The archaeological evidence from Arabia includes rare human burials, suggesting some level of mortuary ritual even during these challenging crossings. The fact that people invested time and energy in treating deceased bodies, even when survival demanded every resource, indicates that death had meaning beyond simple biological fact. The desert, by making death ever-present, may have intensified human consciousness of mortality and driven the development of cognitive and cultural responses to death that characterize our species. The 5th lesson relates to storytelling and narrative as survival tools. How did populations maintain knowledge about Arabia across the long arid periods when the peninsula was uninhabitable? How did descendants of those who successfully crossed remember routes, water sources, and survival strategies? The answer almost certainly involves storytelling. Information encoded in memorable narratives, stories about ancestors who crossed deserts, found water, escaped dangers, could be transmitted across generations, even when that information wasn't immediately useful. Modern research on memory shows that information embedded in stories is remembered better than abstract facts. Our brains seem wired for narrative, and this wiring may have evolutionary origins in environments where story-encoded information meant survival. The desert taught that stories matter, that the best hunters and gatherers are also good storytellers, and that cultural memory maintained through narrative is as important as any technology. We became a storytelling species, partly because stories kept us alive. The 16th lesson involves what might be called ecological humility, recognition that humans are part of ecosystems, not separate from or superior to them. Populations crossing Arabia depended utterly on the megafauna that indicated water sources, the plants that signaled edible resources, the insects whose presence revealed environmental conditions. They couldn't dominate these ecosystems through force, but had to understand and work within ecological relationships. This forced a kind of respect for and attention to non-human life that agricultural and industrial societies later abandoned. Indigenous peoples worldwide often maintain this ecological awareness, this understanding of humans as embedded in rather than separate from nature. This worldview may have deep roots in prehistoric hunter-gatherer experiences where survival demanded intimate ecological knowledge. The desert taught that humans don't conquer nature but adapt to it, that other species aren't just resources but teachers and guides, and that long-term survival requires working with rather than against ecological processes. The 17th lesson concerns the value of diversity, not just biological and economic diversity discussed earlier, but cultural and cognitive diversity. The archaeological evidence shows that multiple populations with different tool-making traditions, different strategies, different approaches all successfully crossed Arabia at various times. There wasn't one right way to make the crossing, but multiple viable approaches. This demonstrates that diversity of methods, perspectives, and strategies provides advantages at population level, even if specific approaches sometimes fail at individual level. Modern organizations are rediscovering this lesson, that diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones, that multiple perspectives generate better solutions, that cognitive diversity enhances problem solving. The desert taught this thousands of years ago. Populations that maintained some diversity in strategies that allowed for individual variation in approaches that didn't demand absolute conformity, were more resilient than those insisting on single correct approach. We inherited capacity for cultural diversity that, while sometimes generating conflict, provides adaptive advantages. The 18th lesson involves scale understanding that significant changes happen across timescales longer than individual lifespans and spatial scales larger than individual territories. The climate cycles that created and destroyed Green Arabia operated over thousands of years. The migration routes that successfully crossed the peninsula spanned hundreds of kilometers. Grasping these scales required thinking beyond immediate personal experience, integrating information across time and space, and planning at scales that transcended individual lives. This capacity for thinking at large scales, temporal and spatial, distinguishes human cognition. We can contemplate deep time, can plan for futures we won't live to see, can conceive of spaces we'll never personally visit. While immediate survival often demands focus on here and now, humans also maintain awareness of larger contexts. The desert taught that immediate and distant both matter, that tomorrow's survival depends on understanding yesterday's patterns, and that local conditions reflect larger systems. The final lesson, the 19th, might be called wisdom rather than knowledge. Knowledge is information. Wisdom is knowing how to apply information appropriately. The populations that successfully crossed Arabia possessed not just facts about water sources and edible plants, but wisdom about when to act and when to wait, when to persist and when to retreat, when to follow tradition and when to innovate. This wisdom couldn't be reduced to rules or algorithms, but required judgment developed through experience and transmitted through cultural apprenticeship. Modern education systems often emphasize knowledge acquisition over wisdom development, perhaps undervaluing the latter. But the desert taught that wisdom matters as much as knowledge, that good judgment can't be replaced by extensive information, and that the wisest decision makers integrate rational analysis with intuition developed through experience. The elders who guided desert crossings weren't just repositories of facts, but wise judges of situations. And their wisdom made the difference between successful and failed expansions. These 19 lessons, from environmental impermanence to the value of wisdom, weren't learned once and finished. They were learned repeatedly, reinforced through generations, tested constantly against harsh reality, and refined through the winnowing process of survival. They became, quite literally, second nature to humans. They shape not just what we know, but how we think. Not just our cultures, but our cognition. Not just our histories, but our futures. The desert wastelands were terrible teachers, demanding, unforgiving, fatal to those who failed their lessons. But they were effective teachers. The lessons stuck. They're with us still, embedded in psychological predispositions, cultural universals, and the accumulated wisdom that humanity carries forward. When modern humans face environmental challenges, make strategic decisions, cooperate on difficult projects, innovate under pressure, or persist through adversity, we're drawing on capabilities refined through thousands of generations of desert crossing. The wastelands made us who we are, and their wisdom guides us still.